Here's a question for you. Do you like the Mandate of Heaven? Well, how about Highlander? How about playing the board game Risk as you LARP as Littlefinger, slowly making all your friends want to punch you in the face? Well, what if I told you you could have all of that and much, much more with a nice sprinkle of D&D on top of it all? Now, I'm of course talking about the criminally underrated D&D setting of Birthright. A setting where you, yes, that's right, you are the ruler for better or worse. Suddenly you're not just rolling dice for fireball damage, well, yeah, you could be doing that, but you're also deciding taxes, marching armies, forging alliances, and hopefully not getting assassinated in your sleep. Now, this was wildly different in a very different way from anything D&D had done before or since, and not different in a kind of kooky, and I'm sorry here, try-hard type of way like Planescape or Spelljammer. This was different in a way of trying to legitimately push D&D in a new direction. Now, sadly, like with the fan-favorite settings like Dark Sun and Ravenloft, with their cool kid cults smoking cigarettes in the back of the school, Birthright has meanwhile been tied up and forgotten in the locker room. I mean, in the modern day, they have literally been abandoned by D&D with next to zero prospect of ever coming back into the limelight, which is a shame because Birthright deserves so much more. So in this video, we're digging into all of it. How it actually came to be, what makes it so distinct and compelling, and how it almost disappeared completely, and why fans are still keeping it alive decades later to explore whatever happened to Birthright. Hello everyone, my name is Otto and welcome to Exits Examined. In this channel, we'll be exploring series, franchises, and more after their prime time has seemingly come to an end. If that sounds good to you, there is a like and subscribe button below, and I want to give, as always, a huge shout out to my patrons who keep this channel possible. Thank you. Birthright was originally released back in 1995 by Richard Baker III and Colm McComb, and is easily one of the most ambitious settings D&D has ever put out, and honestly way ahead of its time. This is far removed from your classic murder hobo adventure vibe. Although, sure, you could do that if you want, you little rascal you, but if you did, you'd be missing the point. This is all about political machinations, tax routes, and alliance building. In Birthright, even at level 1, you're not just some scrappy wanderer, you are a ruler. Now, if for some of you that sounds ho-hum and boring, don't worry, because this setting also swings hard into the wild side. There are grotesque, terrifying monsters unlike anything else in D&D, and one of the most fascinating takes on halflings this game has ever produced. Now, the best part of it all is that it feels cohesive. The mechanics and the world building are tightly designed, so the pieces actually work together with purpose. And yeah, on top of that, the Game of Thrones comparisons are impossible to miss. Both draw heavy influence from the War of the Roses, both are fascinated with the messy politics of nobility, and hey, in both of them, there's even an Iron Throne at the heart of it all. So let's take a look beneath the fantasy hood here and see how all of these, at first seemingly wildly different pieces, fit all together. And with Birthright, everything comes back to its origin story. And well, like a surprisingly large number of fantasy settings, it starts with racism. Seriously, why does so much fantasy love racism? Anyway, the short version is this. The elves were here first, the humans showed up later, everyone got along for about 5 minutes, and then humanity does what humanity does best and starts a conflict. Cue centuries of grudge and bloodshed and, of course, war. Now, eventually, the elves got the short end of the stick, and this is really interesting because it's not because the humans were better fighters or elves couldn't reproduce enough to keep up with us horny humans like in The Witcher. Actually, it's because the elves didn't have priest or gods. Divine powers were completely foreign to them, and they didn't really know how to respond to this until the big bad god of evil, Azrai, sidled up to them and started whispering some sweet, seducing promises. Of course, signing a deal with the world's version of the devil didn't exactly work out well for them, or anyone else for that matter, but to their credit, they didn't really know who or what he was, because remember, this was all new to them. Regardless, the other gods gathered their own armies, and the two sides clashed on the slopes of Mount Desmar, and the resulting fight was absolutely apocalyptic. This is your classic, big, cinematic, knockdown, drag-out showdown. Think Harry Potter versus Voldemort, The Last Alliance versus Sauron, or your furious cat versus your unsuspecting sleeping friend. Take your pick. The battle is basically the setting's Big Bang. The elves, realizing that they've been duped, turned against Azrai mid-fight, but things were still looking pretty desperate. In the end, the gods could only stop Azrai by sacrificing themselves, unleashing a cataclysmic explosion that wiped them all out. But here's the thing. Their power did not vanish. Instead, it blasted out across the battlefield and got absorbed by some mortals. So that divine godliness, goodliness rained back onto the battlefield, imbuing hundreds with divine power straight into their blood. And this is where the real Birthright hook kicks. So there are a few different bloodlines depending on the god it came from, and they all have different shapes and strengths, each granting unusual powers. And yes, passing your bloodline is actually a very big part of the game. You can literally play as the descendants of your previous characters, carrying that divine spark into the next generation. It adds this dynastic layer that feels much more like Crusader Kings, which is such a cool thing to say about a D&D setting. And as a fun aside, there actually is a Crusader Kings 2 mod for Birthright. Now, the game itself divides characters into a few categories depending on their blood type. So you got these scions, who are blooded individuals who carry divine essence but don't necessarily rule anything. You also got regents, who are scions who actually govern a realm, and finally unblooded, who are basically just ordinary guys. They're perfectly playable, a bit of loser energy here, but hey, they can't all be winners, right? But you can totally have a fun and interesting campaign as one. Now, you might be asking, how does this tie into that Highlander thing I mentioned at the start? Well, I am so glad you asked, because this is where it gets really interesting. So you can increase your blooded power, and one way to do this is the boring way, aka good rulership, or hey, you could just go and kill another blooded and steal their power. So in essence, all scions are essentially walking targets. Now, this duality is what makes Birthright so compelling. On one end, you can run a grounded, almost historical campaign, but on the other, you've got these blooded nobles dueling with enchanted weapons, ripping each other's souls out, and hoarding divine essence like some type of greedy little blood raccoon. And there are so many interesting gameable implications in here. So maybe you could play as a child from an out-of-wedlock affair from a regent, or maybe you could play as someone trying to fight the dark urge of their Azrai bloodline inside themselves. The irony is kind of perfect. The gods sacrifice themselves to stop bloodshed, just to guarantee centuries of more bloodshed. So thanks for that, guys. I feel like gods in fantasy are always causing way more issues for us mortals than they're solving. Now, speaking of issues, we've got to talk about probably the biggest problems, we'll call them that arose from all of this blooded stuff. So that brings us to one of the coolest parts of the setting, the On-Shaylin. These are what happens when the bloodlines get taken to their most grotesque extremes. These basically are scions who have the bloodline of Azrai in them, and if they keep on being naughty little sausages and stealing other people's blood, it eventually twists them into something totally monstrous, both literally and figuratively. Now, there are several in here, and some of them even rule realms and command armies. Others are nearly mindless beasts, and what makes them so cool is that they aren't just random monsters. They are the monsters with a capital M. So for example, there's only one Sphinx in the setting. They're unique, memorable, and sometimes even sympathetic, and you can build an entire campaign around one. So of course, we gotta take the Gorgon as the example. He is the big bad of Birthright, the Sauron of the setting. He's basically a walking in-game boss, a master of all combat with limitless resources and armies at his command. But the Gorgon isn't the only one worth mentioning. We got the White Witch, who is lurking in the frozen north, and the Siren is another great standout, who is one of the more neutral ones who just wants to be left alone. You also got ones like the Boar, who is a house-sized beast, as well as a host of others. Now, if these aren't terrifying enough, piercing the heart of another scion will increase your own bloodline power, but sometimes your own bloodline will be overwhelmed and you change bloodlines. So what this means is that sometimes when a hero slays one of the big bad on Shaylin, they end up becoming one themselves. And because of that and how incredibly tough they are, it's almost impossible that one person could ever overcome them. Which is lucky because this just so happens to be a game where you can control entire kingdoms. Because as opposed to most D&D settings where you spend 90% of your time as a low-level loser mucking around in dungeons and God knows where else, in this you are a mover, a shaker of things if you will. Domain management isn't some hazy in-game reward, it's baked in from level 1. So what this means is that at the domain level, the world runs like a grand strategy game. Time moves in months and years, and you're managing provinces, trade networks, temples, and armies. The thing is, yes, this was a thing in D&D before, but more as an afterthought, and in this, the difference is that they are all interconnected. So each domain has its own strengths and weaknesses, and as a regent, you spend not so creatively named regency points to pull strings, raise troops, pass laws, or hold on to allies. It's a system that forces you to think long term. You'll be suppressing rebellions, appointing lieutenants to run your realm while you're off dragon slaying, and hoping those lieutenants don't enjoy a bit of the old backstabbery. Now again, I know for some people, management equals boring, but the scale here translates to combat as well, with entire battle systems for mass, large-scale engagements between armies, and it's just incredible how well all of this was woven together. And the looming goal over all of this is probably the Iron Throne. Now, once, Enyor was a mighty empire united under a single ruler, but that empire fractured, leaving behind squabbling princes and petty kings. The throne itself sits in the old capital, a symbol of unity that no one can actually maintain. Now, in practice, warlords and regents have come and gone briefly before being toppled by rivals. Now, if all of that sounds a lot like Westeros, that's because, yeah, it is. And considering the similarity in the name as well as the themes, I think it's safe to say our boy George was a fan of Birthright. After all, he was a card-carrying RPG fan. You know, in Birthright, you've got ancient artifacts, magical bloodlines, and dynasties fighting for the good old Iron Throne. But let's be honest, none of it means anything unless you have the right dice. And that's where Dice Envy comes in. They've been around since 2017, and they run one of the longest standing monthly dice subscription boxes in the world. These are high quality, high-end dice with a team of in-house designers constantly cranking out fresh molds and new styles. Their crown jewel is the Infinity D4, which is this patented upgrade from the classic Caltrop. One of my personal favorite sets of theirs is the Rolling River. It's metal framed in copper with a gorgeous rich teal blue enamel. It has this really nice weight in your hand, feeling elegant and just as something special on the table. Now, if you subscribe, you get first dibs on upcoming sets, sometimes months before they hit the site. And if you just want to window shop, sign up for their newsletter. You'll get weekly discount codes and release alerts. So if you're ready to upgrade your table, check out Dice Envy. I'm really happy to support them. Links in the description below and on the screen. And hey, you'll be directly helping me support the channel, which I always appreciate. So go forth and maybe even roll better than your enemies. Anyway, the world itself, Cerelia, is divided into a few broad cultural regions, each inspired by a real-world history, but with their own fantasy twist. So basically what we got here is a kind of standard Eurocentric medieval world, roided up a bit with some fantasy. So you've got the fractured heartland with the Iron Throne, which is very medieval Western Europe. But you've also got Rejurik, which is pine-clad highlands and tundra in the northwest, which is basically Norse Scandinavian flavor. And the southeastern lands called Kanasi are a bit more Moorish Arabic influence. So I'm sure you get the picture by now. Now, what really makes these regions stand out is the sheer level of detail. Each realm has its own rulers, politics, NPCs, and adventure hooks, all tailored to the domain system, and both internal and external threats, which gives it so much replayability and depth. One campaign might see you playing a high priest ruling a tiny theocracy, and another could have you as a merchant prince turning trade routes into weapons. And because the size and the scale of the world is expanded, you can bet other aspects of the setting are as well, with a great example being magic. Magic in Birthright works a little differently than in your average D&D world. On one hand, it's a low fantasy setting. Most people will never see a fireball in their life, but on the other hand, it's also high fantasy because the few people who can sling, if you will, are slinging some serious magic at regional levels of power. So you could have a spell that lays waste to entire domains. And again, this is great because it works on a gameplay level. A massive kingdom spanning D&D game needs massive kingdom spanning spells. But even this is tied into the narrative because, in fact, only scions can be true wizards, and only those who have a realm can cast those realm-level spells. Now, this is all amazing because, honestly, there are way too few games where you actually get to feel like you have this godlike power, and you get to feel the sheer terrifying prospect of what it must feel like to face off against one of these godly high-level mages to your average medieval peasant Joe. And these kind of subtle but really intentional and meaningful changes to the generic fantasy trope goes into the playable races in Birthright as well. Now, at first glance, they look pretty standard. Humans, elves, dwarves, and halflings. But the setting twists them in ways that make them feel fresh and sometimes even alien compared to your usual D&D lineup. Now, humans, of course, are the dominant race, but instead of being a bland catch-all, they're divided into several distinct cultures, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. Elves in Birthright are not your Tolkien-inspired wise forest friends. They are off racist elves who, to their credit, are very much a victim of colonization. Humans, for their part, remember that elves literally switched sides at the last minute in the Great War against the Dark God, so there's centuries of bad blood between them, not helped along by the elven penchant for hunting humans who wander into their realms. Now, dwarves get less of a radical reimagining, but they're still solidly done literally. The books make a point of noting that your average dwarf weighs around 200 pounds, which, wow, that is a meaty boy. Now, probably one of the most fascinating races in the setting, and one that might surprise you, are the halflings. These are not your typical cozy hobbit-inspired villagers. In Birthright, halflings are refugees, survivors of a homeland overrun by a great evil in a place called the Shadow World, which is yet another interesting, entirely other facet of Birthright. The Shadow World is a twisted parallel reflection of the world. The halflings fled this world, but to this day they're caught between two realities, so that's why they're called halflings. This gives them strange, unsettling abilities tied to crossing between worlds, making them mysterious, rare, and scattered. But the Shadow World is not all bad. It can be used as a shortcut, since each pace there covers hundreds of paces in the real world, but doing so is very dangerous. Now, one of the first things you're going to notice about Birthright is what is not there. A lot of these standard fantasy creatures are missing, like gnomes. Goblins do show up, but even then they're different. Instead of being cannon fodder, they're treated as a proper people with their own realms, armies, and trade routes. And the world itself is very Tolkien-esque sensibility, and it wears this influence proudly, but knows what to do with it and make it its own thing. It's gritty without being grimdark, consistent without being boring. You get the sense that every kingdom, every border, every political squabble is thought out, and the presentation matched that ambition. The core box set was stuffed with gorgeous maps, evocative interior art, army cards, and it really just made the world feel alive. The book itself had a Celtic-inspired aesthetic, from the names to the tone to the setting. It all felt cohesive and classy in a way that a lot of other TSR lines didn't always manage. So wow, as you can imagine, playing Birthright can be a lot. This wasn't your grab a sword and run into a cave style of D&D. Turns could take ages because you weren't just running one adventurer, you were running domains, planning wars, and keeping your regency intact. The system even had siegecraft and army battle mechanics, so this could be a really difficult game to play. I mean, it's essentially two games because one, you got the standard role-playing game, and two, you got this other, which was the domain game. And GMs could easily get overwhelmed determining the NPC realms, actions, calculating gold, etc., etc. If this is your first D&D game, God forbid, Godspeed is all I can say. And I haven't even touched on 70% of the other mechanics and ideas in here like emergent storytelling. But, it's not as overwhelming as it seems, because I cannot stress enough how well this is put together. And you can tell that the designers really care, because the amount of gameplay and sandbox potential and flavor has to truly be one of the most bang for buck settings out there. Maybe it was too good a value for its own good, but we'll get to that later in the video. So speaking of that, let's talk about the next part of Birthright's story, how it all actually came together. Now, calling Birthright unexpected for D&D might be putting it mildly. TSR had a habit of swinging for the fences with new D&D settings, but even by their standards, this one felt like a curveball. So how did we actually get here in the first place? Well, let's take it back. When Dungeons & Dragons first launched in 1974 under a company called TSR, the game was originally dead simple. No adventures, no campaign settings, no tie-in novels. The philosophy was basically give the players a rule set and let them do the imagination. After all, that's what this is all about, right? Well, apparently that's not what it's all about, because as the years would go on, the adventures and the settings would get more and more elaborate. With narrative-heavy settings like Dragonlance, TSR didn't stay small for long. Through the late 70s and 80s, the company was exploding and doubling in size year after year. And then, due to a variety of reasons that deserve its own video, but most generally due to good old boring mismanagement, they started losing money almost as fast as they had been growing. So they started pumping out campaign settings and rulebooks at a breakneck, borderline unhinged pace, sometimes double-digit releases in some years to try to make back some of that money. But that kind of schedule was never sustainable, and sure enough, TSR eventually collapsed under its own weight before being scooped up by everyone's favorite company, Wizards of the Coast. For all of that chaos, there was a silver lining. That turbulent era was exactly what gave us some of the most experimental and beloved settings in D&D history. Planescape, Dark Sun, and smack dab in the middle of all this creative frenzy, along came Birthright. Now, Birthright's story began in those turbulent years when TSR was scrambling for ideas and would ask designers to pitch something. One of those designers was Rich Baker, and he pitched the Sunset Empire, a wild mashup of multiple suns and dinosaurs. Other designers like Jeff Grubb pitched airships and mountaintop kingdoms, and there were even other ideas like a patchwork world where you literally didn't know what was 20 miles away until you arrived. Cool ideas, all of them, but TSR's brass had something else in mind. A world where the player is the king, which, interestingly enough, Baker had no idea where this idea came from, but suspects it was designed to appeal to the TSR president, who, quote, came from money and lived in a world of lords and serfs, end quote. Which is probably not the best way you'd want your employees to describe you, I imagine. Anyway, Rich Baker and Colin McComb were handed the task of designing the darn thing, with their only guidance being that this is a world where every PC is a king. Baker led much of the writing, drawing on his love of history and historical board games like Empire of the Middle Ages. Baker also mined material from an unpublished fantasy world of his own, and I wouldn't be surprised if Highlander wasn't at least a little bit of an influence. McComb, meanwhile, took charge of other cultures and helped flesh out the Ruins of Empire book. Playtesters and fellow designers contributed too. Jeff Grubb, for example, suggested the idea of gods dying and leaving behind divine bloodlines. So, what all this chaos eventually birthed was Birthright. The Birthright campaign setting, released in 1995, was basically the Bible for this world. This is where you want to start if you want the origin story, a breakdown of the major kingdoms and races, and of course the mechanics that made the setting tick. TSR went surprisingly hard on Birthright, like much harder than you'd probably expect for such a niche idea. What followed was a whirlwind of supplemental content over the next couple years, a genuine flurry of activity that showed just how much they wanted the setting to take off. Now, the first few of these basically expanded the different regions of the world. So, Cities of the Sun dove into the people of southeastern Cerealia, giving you kind of an Arabian Nights vibe. Then you got the Rajuric Highlands, which was that Nordic-inspired territory I mentioned earlier, full of druids, nature worship, and a healthy disdain for cities. You also got Tribes of the Heartless Waste, which were about the Voss people and their harsh Siberian climate. And finally, Havens of the Great Bay, which leaned into more of a seafaring adventure vibe, which was perfect timing too because later supplements expanded on further naval battle rules. Beyond those, most of the extras were region-specific expansion, like Player's Secrets of Endear, which dives into domain play for that particular country. And then there were the manuals, the Book of Magecraft and the Book of Priestcraft, which both deserve a nod because magic in Birthright does, as we talked about earlier, work very differently. There was also a good number of different adventures in here, like Warlock of the Stone Crowns, and other books as well, including the Legend of the Hero King that expands on the random event mechanics, and also Blood Enemies Abomination of Cerealia, which details the Onshalan, their histories, abilities, and domains. So all great stuff. But this is the really sad part, because Birthright only existed for a few short years, which stings even more because it wasn't for lack of love of the content. TSR, as you can tell, really threw everything they could at this, even including really hard to find now pewter miniatures, and in just 2 years they cranked out an absolute flood of material, so what could possibly have gone wrong here? Well, this is where it gets a little frustrating. A lot of what doomed Birthright came down to, again, plain old mismanagement, because TSR basically shot themselves in the foot. The box set was so lavish and expensive to produce that they were actually selling at a loss. On top of that, it was an extremely short print run with only 45,000 copies. And on top of all of that, there wasn't even that much press or ads for this, so it just doesn't even make sense. Imagine putting all of this energy into a massive launch, but to only sell it at a loss. You just get a sense that in the end years, TSR was just going off the rail. And speaking of that, timing didn't do Birthright any favors either. This was right before Wizards of the Coast swooped in, and when they took over fully, they took one look at Birthright and said, no thank you. It wasn't a failure of design or ideas. Birthright had both. It was just a perfect storm of bad timing, bad pricing, and a market that was already oversaturated. And the results? Birthright basically got killed in the crib, which is a huge shame. But that actually wasn't it, because in those brief years that Birthright was alive, it didn't just live in the rulebooks. TSR gave this the full treatment with its own string of novels, and some of these are not that bad. The first one was The Iron Throne by none other than Simon Hawke, and it really sets the tone, a mix of political maneuvering, war, and personal drama, all while giving a good tour of the world and how it works. It's classic mid-90s fantasy, and hey, even has a dash of scandal with a subplot about an 18-year-old accidentally almost killing a princess during an affair, which is probably not the optimal way to have an affair, if you would have one, not that I would know. Anyway, this was followed up with a sequel, War, in May 1996. There was also Greatheart, also in 1996, which went more into elven culture, The Spider's Test, also in 1996, and The Hag's Contract, which released in, can you guess it, 1996. Which, if you're noticing a trend where almost everything in Birthright was made in 1995 or 1996, then yes, that is a thing. Now, speaking of the books, interestingly, Baker, one of the architects of the Birthright game, which we talked about earlier, was itching to write for the setting himself. Back in the early 90s, TSR's book department occasionally held open auditions, letting staff submit first chapters for potential novels. Baker actually tried his hand at a Ravenloft story, which I would have loved to see, but it was sadly rejected. When Birthright came around, Baker pitched directly to write for it, arguing that he was perfectly positioned to write a novel for the world since, he made it, But in another case of TSR being TSR, initially they weren't interesting, saying that the window was so tight they couldn't trust a first-time novelist. But Baker would eventually get his chance with The Falcon and the Wolf, which was slated to be the 6th Birthright novel. But just weeks before publication, in what I imagine could have only off Baker to no end, TSR stopped producing new titles. Eventually, though, to celebrate Birthright's 10th anniversary, Wizards released a selection of both published and unpublished Birthright products online, including The Falcon and the Wolf. So something of a small redemption at least. Now, it wasn't just books either, because in a bit of an oddity, we also got The Serpent's Eye, which was released, you guessed it, in 1996, and a limited edition comic written by Ed Stark, who was one of the OG creators, who, again, if you're keeping track, sounds a lot like Ned Stark, so more GOT connections. Now, honestly, this thing is kind of the white whale of Birthright merch. Good luck finding a copy in the wild. Even information about how it was made is surprisingly scarce. Now, speaking of other oddballs in here, we got Legacy of Kings, which was supposed to be a board game. And I say supposed to because it never actually hit the shelves, again because of the bad timing with Wizards of the Coast, which again is another shame. However, it was available to play at conventions in the late 90s, and later Wizards would eventually make it available to download for free. Alright, but the big adaptation that most people remember for good reason is the video game Birthright: The Gorgon's Alliance, dropping in 1997. And honestly, it's one of the most ambitious D&D games ever made. At the core, it's this grand strategy game where you step into the shoes of a regent trying to claim the Iron Throne. That means you're juggling warfare, diplomacy, trade routes, magic. Think basically early Total War, except arguably even more complicated. Because it's not just a strategy game. It has a real-time battle system and even includes first-person dungeon crawling using the Doom engine, which is so cool. So that's right, you can go adventuring, picking up a wand of fireballs, and then take it to a battlefield to blast enemy troops. Now, was it perfect? No, not at all. The UI was clunky, the graphics were very 1997, and the sheer depth scared off a lot of casual players. But for people who stuck with it, the Gorgon's Alliance really captured the essence of Birthright like almost nothing else. And yet, no remaster, no sequel, nothing. Meanwhile, we have however many remakes of Resident Evil and The Last of Us. Seriously, game devs stop remastering games from 5 to 10 years ago and give some loves from 20 to 30 years ago. A modern take on the Gorgon's Alliance would be incredible, but given Wizards of the Coast's current priorities, the odds of them dusting off Birthright seems about as slim as the Gorgon turning into a good guy. So that brings us to the question, where is Birthright today, nearly 30 years after its release? Well, officially, it is dead. Baker himself has long since moved on, and these days he's actually working on Elder Scrolls Online. That said, he hasn't completely let go. He still occasionally writes about Birthright on his blog, so the love is still there, at least from the guy who helped make it. As for Wizards of the Coast, at the time of this writing, they're not publishing anything new for Birthright. And again, it's hard to imagine them suddenly reviving it. Although on the bright side, they have released a ton of Birthright material for free online over the years, like the Book of Regency, which originally never even made it to print. Now, compared to the heavy hitters like Forgotten Realms, Planescape, or Dragonlance, the number of people who actively remember, let alone play Birthright is extremely small. But that is not to say there is no life left in here. The Birthright fandom might be tiny, but what it lacks in numbers, it more than makes up for in sheer dedication. The heart of it all throughout the years has been Birthright.net. Basically the nexus for anything and everything related to the setting. The site can be a little tricky to navigate, but it's a goldmine of information, including an entire timeline of the setting and a treasure trove of lore. It also hosts play by email, and Birthright is practically made for this. And I would be remiss not to mention that they were instrumental in bringing in the Birthright 3E conversion. Now, there's also been other conversions as well, even a 5E Birthright one, which shout out to Marsupial Mancer for the excellent work. It's all freely available, and honestly, it's kind of wild how much love has gone into keeping this world playable decades later. Beyond fan rules, there's still some solid coverage in the wider D&D community too. Gamers Tavern ran a great interview with Richard Baker, and the podcast Thacko Hammer put out an excellent episode diving into all things Birthright. And there's even an active Discord server that still hosts play-by-post games, which is another excellent resource. So Birthright is easily one of D&D's most fascinating settings, and also one of the most overlooked. It wasn't just a campaign world, it was ambitious, mature, and daring, and inspired so much. Even if you take Game of Thrones aside, things like Pathfinder's Kingmaker Adventure and its spiritual successor Seeds of War. And it's no wonder why. The setting was beautifully presented. The artwork, the layout, and maps are all top tier, and the boxed resources made it easy to dive in. But despite all of this love and care, Birthright just never really caught on. And the sad part about it is that a lot of it wasn't even its fault. Despite the incredible design, it was just bad timing. And it would have been really interesting to see a timeline where this was released just a few years earlier, when it could have time and space to just exist. Now, although it's a shame official support for this is gone and only lasted a few years, but despite all of that, Birthright remains a unique, brilliant, and unforgettable corner of D&D. One that deserves to be remembered, explored, and played. So, in conclusion, for all you blooded out there, watch out for that pesky Gorgon. And even more importantly, watch your backs for all those other blooded out there trying to steal your delicious divine powers. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all the support. I want to give a huge shout out to Rhett Samaral for helping me fact check and being a wealth of Birthright knowledge. I also want to give another huge shout out to June Solar for helping me fact check and again bounce ideas off of. They're actually the author of The Lost Princess of House Roulette, which is an unofficial game adventure for Birthright and is excellent, and I would highly recommend if you're curious. As always, no shout out is ever complete without talking about my incredible patrons who keep this channel alive and running. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you want to find out more ways to support me, you can check out my Patreon link in the description below, where you can get access to cool things like the channel's Discord and Patreon exclusive videos. As always, if you ever have any suggestions about what you want me to cover next, please drop a comment and let me know. It's been fascinating to hear. Anyway, one more time, thank you. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.